guys? How's everybody doing today? I just wanted to do a quick review and a little bit of history of this particular snare drum right here. This is, I'm not exactly sure the year. I want to say it was like a 68. It's really not important. What this is a Cleveland era Rogers chrome over brass Powertone snare. Now this particular model of snare drum, the chrome over brass Powertone, there was two different materials for this snare drum. There was a wood Powertone and then the metal one here, which was chrome over brass. There was never a steel Powertone. There is a snare drum that Rogers made called the Super 10, but that went into production after they were done producing this. So the Super 10 was a 10-lug steel snare drum that went into production sometime in the 70s. And this particular snare drum went into production in 1964, I believe, and was in production until 73 when they came out with the Super 10. Now, an interesting thing about this snare drum, if you look online, you could search Rogers catalogs online, and if you go to the year that this snare drum came out, what it says is it says something along the lines of a redesigned snare bed for optimal acoustic performance. I'm paraphrasing, or some crap like that. What that is, essentially, this doesn't have snare beds. It does. It actually does have a snare bed, but they're really shallow. If you look at, say, the snare beds on this Acrolite, okay, obviously you can't see it because I don't have the bottom head off. But what a snare bed is it's an indentation, so to speak, where the snare contacts the head. So what they do is they actually, if the snare bed is like this, okay, so if this right here is the snare bed, all right, all the way around the drum, where the snare sits, it'll actually be indented like this. That way, rather than the snare sitting off the head, it sits on the head and gets more response. So if you go and you look at older snare drums, actually most snare drums, if you look at, say, you know, that Acrolite that I just held up, or a Superphonic, or any snare drum, basically it'll have a fairly deep snare bed. Now on this drum, I guess the thinking was if they have no snare bed, and it actually does have a snare bed. I'm going to get into that. But I guess the thinking was if it had no snare bed at all, it would get, the drum would resonate better. Now, having said all that, it does have a snare bed. I looked online. I did a lot of research. There is a website called Vintage Drum Forum, and there's an expert on there. I'm not going to say his real name, but he's known as the Plowman on the Vintage Drum Forum. This guy knows more about Rogers drums than anybody alive. And from what I was able to gather from what he said and what a few other guys said was the snare bed is actually there, but it is 40 thousandths of an inch. So that's 0.040 of an inch, okay? To give you an idea of how minute that is, a human hair is around between 3 and 4 thousandths of an inch. So if you took like 13.3 or something like that human hairs, put them together in a row and press them up against each other, that's how deep the snare bed would be on this drum. So 40 thousandths of an inch is not much. And I guess like on the wood Powertones, they would just hit it with some sandpaper. On this, obviously, this is a manufactured drum, so it was probably formed in somehow. I don't know how they did it on this drum. Also, the bearing edges are different. So if you look at the earlier holiday model drums, okay, before they came out, because the Powertone was actually a whole line of drums. So there was Powertone toms, there was Powertone bass drum. This was the Powertone snare. They also changed the bearing edges on these drums to take full advantage of mylar heads, which were becoming popular around the mid to early 60s. Before that, everything was calf, and they had a more rounded bearing edge. And a rounder bearing edge gives you a more full tone, whereas A sharper bearing edge, a less rounded bearing edge, gives you a more attacky tone. This snare drum cracks. It absolutely cracks. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a quick sound sample. I'm going to use my standard settings for what I use for all my EQ and compression across the board for all my videos. I eventually do EQ to the song or whatever I'm playing, but for this, I'm just going to leave the EQ to what I had it originally, where it's like my starting point. Give me a second. Let me take off this Superphonic and throw this thing on, and we'll do a test. We'll do a sound sample of it. The one thing you'll really notice about this drum is it's freaking heavy. It's chrome over brass, so it is a really, really heavy snare drum. The wires I have on it are 24-strand pure sounds. Now, before I bought these wires, I wasn't aware of how shallow the snare bed was. I'm thinking maybe I would have been better off going with some 20 strands. Sure, it's a good thing I didn't get to 42, because on old drums, don't put 42-strand wires on them, because the snare beds aren't wide enough. I would assume that this has a very, very narrow snare bed. I had no idea about the snare bed until I put these wires on, and looking at it, I can't see a snare bed at all. It's obviously it's there, but I haven't noticed any weird choking issues or anything like that with this drum. It is a really good sounding snare drum. I like to say it growls. It's got a lot of cracky, meaty balls to it, for lack of a better word. So this drum right now, it's tuned to I would say a cracky high pitch. This is the drum I used on a couple covers I did of. One was a Deep Purple cover, and one was a James Brown cover, obviously, especially with the James Brown. Clyde Stubblefield and Jabbo Starks, those guys, yeah, it was Jabbo. Yeah, it was Jabbo. Those guys, is it Jabo or Jabbo? I apologize, I'm not sure. But those guys really had high-pitched snare drums. I mean, they used Superphonics, and they just cranked the crap out of them. I have a Superphonic. I have two Superphonics, actually, but I got them sounding the way I like them to sound, and I didn't really want to mess up the tuning, so I just grabbed this and threw it on and just really cranked it up. So right now, this is a really high, cracky tone. So let's give it a listen. Now, I'm going to take this same drum, and let's tune it down to a medium pitch. I would actually call this more of a medium high, so let's take a listen to it. All right, let's take it down a little lower. All right, so this would be, I would consider this a medium pitch right now. All right, you notice it's got some fuzzy overtones. I don't know if they're coming through in the mic, but it does have a bit of a ring to it. Normally, I have just a small little piece of moon gel on it. I don't know where that's at, so I'm going to pull the piece I had off what I use on my Superphonic, which actually, this is bigger. Normally, I use a piece about half the size of this. So I'm just going to put it up by the rim. Let's get a listen now. That ring is still there, but it's not horrible. I mean, this drum resonates quite a bit. Okay, now let's take it. Let's see what it does at a lower pitch. All right, so here's a low pitch with a little moon gel. Ooh, I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah, it's got a cool sound to it. sounds good fat. It sounds, I should say, let me rephrase that. It sounds fat at a lower pitch, but not overly fat, you know? It's got some meat to it. And then, incidentally, the heads on this thing I'm using Remo Ambassador coated on the top, and then I'm using a Remo Ambassador weight snare side. You absolutely have to use a snare side head on this thing. I mean, you should always use a snare side head, but especially on this drum because of the really shallow, almost non-existent snare beds. But like I said, I put heads on this kit before I was aware of how shallow the snare beds were. So I would actually probably go back and maybe even throw a diplomat on it if I were to do it again. So overall, I mean, it's a decent sounding snare drum. And a really cool thing about this drum is you could get them for around that $200 price point or under or over. It all depends on the condition of the drum. This is a great way to get into that vintage snare drum market. This is a good, solid snare drum. It's kind of like a poor man's Dynasonic a little bit. Everybody wants the coveted Dynasonic. This is kind of a good alternative to that. All right. That's it, you guys. And for you Rogers experts, if I missed anything, please leave your questions, comments, and hate mail in the description below. Also, you guys, if you like these videos, please click the subscribe button and hit that bell notification and go through all that crap YouTube makes you go through now with options and deciding if you want to get notified, because God forbid when we subscribe to the channel, we actually get notifications when that channel posts a video. I thought that was the whole point of subscribing to a channel, but apparently YouTube has decided differently. All right, guys, that's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.